Now, I just gave you a synopsis of how the Russians ended up moving into Central Asia from the 1600s, or yeah, really the 1600s, late 1500s, all the way up until the 1800s. But I want to go back a second and look at their early entry. Uh, and the Russians' early entry was really in the north. And it was a divide and conquer sort of tactic. What they sought is to exploit clan differences within Kazakhstan, offering various groups protection from their enemies during the 1730s and 1740s. And they actually signed agreements to come in and protect this or that group, so they were invited. So this was a lot like a protectorate at first, the way that the Russians first came in. So, and I'm talking about the first major settlements, not the early incursions by Ivan IV. Ivan IV really brought them down this direction, and then it wasn't until the early 1700s that they began to establish a presence here through this protectorate. So this gave them partial control of the steppe at first, and then gradually Russia also increased its administrative apparatus and began to usurp power from local leaders. They gradually increased their hold, building new forts right down to Almaty in 1853. So again, the first forts were built in Semipalatinsk. There's my cursor. Semipalatinsk over here. And eventually, within about 150 years, they moved all the way down to Almaty down here. So by the mid-19th century, Russia is bordering on the Central Asian Khanates. And these are the Khanates. So Khanates are these kingdoms. So you've got the Khivan Khanate, you've got the Bukharan Khanate, and the Kokand Khanate. These are the kingdoms of Central Asia. And by this period, Russia is bordering, by the mid-19th century, Russia is really bordering on these Khanates. So note that this was a process of building forts and towns, demonstrating the dual purpose of Russian expansion into Central Asia. It was trade, but it was also security. Again, Omsk, Semipalatinsk, Usta Kamenogorsk, all these forts that were built on the way. Now, once they got further south, it was all about dividing and conquering. So these were the three khanates or kingdoms. The Bukharan kingdom was made up of about 3 million people at the time. The Khivan had only about 500,000 people, and the Kokand kingdom had about 1.5 million. They were all rivals. They were competing for political and military control amongst one another, and they couldn't cooperate even against this common enemy that was up against their borders. But also remember the nomads. Towns were confronted with their own nomadic invaders. So in Bukhara, the center of the Bukharan Khanate or kingdom, you had marauders who were coming in from the desert around you. Same thing going on in Kokand and Khiva. You had all these different actors, these nomadic invaders who were trying to get in. So the Bukharan, Khivan, and Kokand Emirates all survived in a state of almost constant rebellion with regions, and within each of these regions. Sometimes they were completely independent or out of their control. In other words, you had very weak kingdoms in Central Asia at the time. To give you an example of just how weak, take the case of the largest one, again, the Bukharan Khanate or kingdom. The Bukharan Emir tried to use a heavy, complex administration to unify his entire kingdom. But he had 250,000 square kilometers under his control, much of which was often inaccessible. He simply didn't have roads to get to many of the places that were out there. By the time the Russians arrived, the Bukharan army was made up of about 13,000 infantry, about 500 horse soldiers, 620 artillerymen. But the soldiers were poorly paid, they were poorly trained. They had to cultivate land or trade to make ends meet, so they weren't full-time soldiers. They were no match for the Russians when the Russians came in. Now, the Russians took Tashkent in 1865. They took Samarkand. Let me find a better picture of this. Here's the expanding empire. So by 1865, they had taken Tashkent. By 1868, they had taken Samarkand. This was a big blow to the Bukharan Khanate. And then in 1873, they took Khiva. In 1876, they took Kokand. 1884, they took Merv, where Turkmen tribes quickly gave up. And so here's a picture of the Russian Empire by 1900, by the end of the 19th century. There were international dimensions to all this, of course, as well. George Curzon, who was Britain's Secretary of State for India, watched really in fear of what he called Russia's, quote, unchecked and apparently irresistible advance into Central Asia, commenting that, quote, while the inhabitants of the regions are amazed at the wealth of England, they are impressed by the numerical strength of Russia. So Russia was really coming full force into Central Asia. In 1873, as a result of this, the Russians and Brits signed a formal agreement that they would call it quits at the Amu Darya River. That would separate that would be the demarcation line between Russian and British spheres of influence. It was very 19th century of them. So let me find that map over here, and we can trace it down to the Amu Darya. And the Amu Darya is the river that runs just right along here. So this is the Amu Darya River. Okay, so this was the separation of the spheres of influence. So Russians were now in Central Asia. But what sort of control did they have? It was really a bifurcated system of self-administration with Russian military rule at the very top. And so you can see that the Khanates were still in existence, that they were really puppet regimes. And so what the Russians relied on was self-administration. This was empire on the cheap. Make them administer themselves with oversight by the Russians and by Russian generals in particular. So local leaders were left in charge of very insulated societies that aspired for independence. But there were important splits within society. You had reformers who took advantage of Russia's role in the region, hoping that it would help modernize the area. But they also wanted to maintain traditional cultures. These were the liberals and the revolutionaries among the local population, who are going to become much more important when we talk in the next class about the rise of the Soviet Union. So Russians sought to exercise control at the least possible cost. So what did this mean? So they left the native Khanates largely intact, using their administrations as the core and leaving them in charge of internal affairs. The Russians were in charge of external affairs. So there was no colonial ministry, but Central Asia was divided up into these 9 oblasts or regions. And each one was ruled by military governors appointed by the Ministry of War, who were sort of sitting right next to essentially the emirs. So in essence, you had military rule, where locals were largely left to rule themselves under the watchful eye of these military governors, who would issue top-down orders, often inconsistent with what those further down actually wanted. Now, there were really important, sorry, this is where I should be. There were really important problems with military rule here. And you see problems with military, similar problems with military rule in other places. One of them is that the military is more interested in pushing boundaries than administrating. Administration is not something that militaries like to do or are very good at it. Commanders really lack the skills for handling civil affairs in Central Asia. And we've seen a lot of the same things, of course, as we've tried to administer Iraq up until very recently. But another problem was that you had inefficient administrators, and often worse. There was this small European community, families. Their family was thousands of miles away. They would gather at casinos. They would squander their money on wine, women, game. So you had the rise of prostitution in these very conservative areas. Lots of alcohol in these very conservative areas. So it's important that you didn't really get the cream of the crop coming into Central Asia from Russia. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. There were other problems. You had communication difficulties within Central Asia and between Central Asia and St. Petersburg, the home of the Russian Empire. And I might have referred to it as Moscow. That's much later. Of course, at this point, St. Petersburg is the home of, is the seat of power in Russia. You also had local disdain for arrogant Russians, and you had corruption. Russians who came in there were interested in personal gain. More problems. You had a lack of preparation of locals for self-government or autonomy. They didn't have training or anything. The Russians simply delegated responsibility to these people as it was convenient. Here, you run it. Here's what we want. We're not going to teach you how to do it like we want, but just do it. And there was minimal oversight, especially in the summer. When you think about summer in Central Asia, the Russians ran away from the burning hot towns basically from May to September. They went to their dachas out into the hills. Those who were left in the cities worked from 8 to 1, and then they cringed in their homes until night, and then they went out and they drank. So this was how Russia administered Central Asia. The outcome of military oversight in this local administration was that they purged the old ways of doing things in Central Asia, and they instituted elections where clan and tribal relations had dominated. Traditional clan and tribal elders worked through unwritten laws previously, and now all that changed. Now they had new representatives of these assemblies that appointed leaders and judges and all these other things that they didn't do before. And they had to come from at least two different kinship groups in order to make them quote unquote legal. But by and large, the same local leaders, as always, won the elections. But now they were under the Russians, and as a result, they were forced to engage in the rules that the Russians set up, but also in bribery of Russian officials, because the Russians were there for personal gain for the most part. And so the local officials were now bribing the Russian officials. Well, to do this, you need more money. And to get more money, you have to increase local taxes. And so now you've got the rise of corruption in this area. Russians added this new layer of bureaucracy. It was a very costly and toxic layer for Central Asians. So here's an example of how corruption played out in Bukhara. There, state officials at high ranks had no fixed salary. They took from those below as they wished. And so minor officials, just like in any business plan, passed these costs along through corruption. All state servants were involved in levying taxes at some level, and there was a very complicated tax system. You had taxes on animals in pairs, taxes on single animals, taxes on water distribution, on vegetable plots and orchards, on alfalfa fields. They were different taxes. You had bridge tolls and custom duties, housing taxes, taxes on people who were in transit, taxes on weighing of goods in the bazaar. According to one contemporary, and here's the quote that you have right here, "The air alone is not taxed in Bukhara." And this led to insurrections. You had an insurrection in Merv in 1800, where there was a general resentment of local elites. You had an insurrection in Kokand in the 1840s over the wheat tax. For the most part, though, peasant anger was much more localized, at the tax collector level only. It was difficult for the peasants to actually get together and fight. So now we get into Russian rule after 1880, and we'll take that on a separate set of slides.